the Alfar king mocked the grave girl, until she found his real body beneath the throne. They called her in to handle the corpse. That was how it always began for Morwenna Graves. Not with an invitation, not with a summons that addressed her by name, but with a runner from the palace telling the lower burial house that there was a body in the corridor, beneath the throne hall, that needed to be removed before morning court. She came because she always came. She brought her tools, her burial cloth, and the particular silence she had learned to wear like a coat, in rooms where she was not welcome. The throne hall of Veyne Palace had never been designed to make a grave girl feel comfortable. High ceilings pressed the sound of court laughter downward. Noble families clustered in their finery along the walls, and when Morwenna walked in with the smell of lower burial house still on her clothes, ash and cold stone and the herbal rinse she used on her hands after a wash, they did not bother to move away quietly. They simply moved. They moved and they whispered, and they let the whispers carry. Death rat, she carries corpse dust on her skin. Do not let her near the wine. Alpha King Alaric Veyne sat on the carved throne at the end of the hall, and he looked at Morwenna the way powerful men looked at inconveniences. Not with cruelty precisely, but with the flat impatience of someone who would have preferred her errand handled by someone less visible. He said it before she reached the body. Do not bring the smell of graves too close to my throne. The court approved with its customary noise. Morwenna said nothing. She crouched beside the guard's body, which lay at the far end of the corridor, beneath the throne dais. Official death tag listed: Rebel Guard, cardiac failure during interrogation. Morwenna placed 2 fingers against the inside of the dead man's wrist. Her grave curse did not speak in words. It spoke in the quality of silence. A body that had died the way its death record claimed would be still. This body was not still. This body had died because it had seen something. Something beneath the throne floor. Something it was not supposed to see. And then, from below the stone, from somewhere under the carved wolf legs of the throne itself, she heard it. 1 knock, 2, 3, 3. Not random. Not settling stone. The sound of something that had been waiting a very long time for someone to finally be standing in the right place to hear it. Morwenna straightened. She turned toward the throne. Alpha King Alaric Veyne was watching her now with an expression that had shifted from impatience to something more alert. She said, "The dead beneath this room are louder than the living on that throne." The court went quiet. She walked forward and placed her palm flat against the stone floor in front of the throne. The grave curse opened. Veins of black ran outward from her hand across the floor in the pattern of old roots, following cracks she had not seen until this moment, reaching the throne legs, circling the base of the dais. The stone hummed. The funeral candles along the walls extinguished, one by one, without wind. And from somewhere beneath the floor, deep and pressured and entirely real, a sound that was not quite a howl rose and fell, and died back into silence. Morwenna looked up at the man on the throne. "You are sitting above a body that has your name." She let the silence hold for 3 seconds, and it is still trying to be buried as yours. She had not always known what the knocking meant. When she was very small, Morwenna thought everyone heard it. She had been raised in the lower burial house by the women who worked there, who had no particular title for what she could do, but understood it well enough to keep her away from the registry room when the records were being falsified. Her father, Bram Graves, had been a royal corpse bearer. He had carried the dead of the palace to their resting places for 17 years. He had been a careful man, a quiet man. one of those workers the palace relied upon precisely because he never asked questions about what he was carrying or where it was supposed to go. He had disappeared 3 years ago. Official death record, plague, lower district, unmarked grave. But when Morwenna touched the death registry and found his entry, the name did not rest. It knocked, softly, insistently, in the way a name knocked when the record attached to it pointed toward the wrong. Death. She understood what that meant now in ways she had not understood it as a child. They did not kill my father when they buried him. They killed him when they made his grave point to the wrong death. She had become a grave girl for reasons that had nothing to do with preference and everything to do with the mathematics of a life where the only tools she had were the ones the court had decided no one respectable would want. She could hear when a burial was wrong. She could hear when a death record lied. She could hear when the dead were being used by the living as foundations rather than acknowledged as people. Her curse did not make the dead speak. It made the living stop pretending the dead had nothing left to say. A grave was not only where a body rested. It was where a lie either ended or learned to rule. Alaric Veyne's court called him the Iron Wolf. They had called him that since his return from the assassination attempt 3 years ago, an attack that had, by official account, nearly killed the Alpha King before High Chancellor Severin. Crow's healers brought him back from the edge of death. The court said he had returned harder, more ruthless, more efficient. They said it approvingly. The way court said things that meant the people in power had decided to stop, being troubled by the cost of power. Plague wards that treated low-rank wolves had been closed. Breeding dependency, the edict said. Lower graves had been cleared for expansion of the royal training ground. Space efficiency, the registry said. Rogues accused of grave rebellion had been executed without extended trial. Kingdom stability, the command said. Morwenna had processed many of the resulting bodies in the lower burial house. She had not known then that the man who signed those orders might not have been entirely the man he appeared to be. She only knew that the bodies did not rest the way bodies rested when they had died honestly. What Severin Crow had done 3 years ago was not the kind of thing that appeared in public records. The throne shadow rite was older than any currently practicing court historian could speak to. It required an alpha on the edge of death, a royal succession crisis, and a chancellor willing to make the calculation that a partial king was more stable than an empty throne. Severin had made that calculation. Alaric's true body had been carried down to the throne crypt by a small number of carefully selected corpse-bearers who were then reassigned, dismissed, or, in the case of Bram Graves, quietly removed from the record. A half-shadow had been shaped from the surviving fraction of Alaric's soul, his face, his voice, his blood scent, the crown memories that could be used to hold the kingdom together, while Severin steered the commands. The half-shadow was not empty. That was the most important thing to understand. He was not empty. He was incomplete. He had memory fragments. He had guilt. He had wolf scent. He had the ability to feel, to choose, to be afraid. He had, somewhere in the hollow space where a full soul should have lived, an awareness that something beneath him was still trying to be buried. He had simply been afraid of what that awareness meant. Alaric had feared death less than he feared discovering he had been ruling as its echo. He found her in the lower corridor after the court cleared. He had not gone to comfort her. He had gone because what she had said was still sitting in his chest in the way that things sat when they were too close to something true to simply be dismissed. He said, "If what you claim has any basis in reality, Do you understand what happens to the command record of the last 3 years? Morwenna turned from the small lantern she had been trimming. A kingdom ruled from a grave is already asking that question. You are using death to claim power, he said. Her voice did not change. Power sits on thrones. Death only waits for someone to stop lying. He left. And he heard it, 3 steps down the corridor, 1 level above the old throne crypt, in the absolute silence of a palace that was pretending nothing had happened tonight. The knock. 1, 2, 3. He stopped walking. He stood in the dark for a long time. He told himself it was the settlement of old stone. He went to bed. He did not sleep. High Chancellor Severin Crowe did not raise his voice. He had not needed to raise his voice in 20 years of managing Veyne Kingdom's most inconvenient truths. He came to Morwenna the morning after the throne hall incident with the measured patience of a man who had already decided what the outcome of the conversation would be and was simply giving her the courtesy of arriving at it herself, he said. The grave girl had suffered a well-documented occupational delusion, common among those who worked too long in proximity to death and began to mistake their own grief projections for supernatural testimony. He said he was willing to provide her with a formal title and permanent placement in the palace burial. Records if she would submit a written account clarifying that her experience in the throne hall had been a stress response, not a prophecy, he said. A kingdom does not need a living king. It needs a throne that never looks empty. His voice was perfectly kind when he said it. That was the worst part. Morwenna looked at him. She heard the death registry in the room, 2 floors below them, give 1 long, flat knock. The sound of a record that knew it was being discussed and found the discussion wanting. She said nothing. She walked out. Severin watched her go with the specific expression of a man adding a name to a list he did not share with anyone, he said, to the empty corridor. The dead are peaceful when the living stop asking them questions. The old corpse-bearer's name was Elias Rook. He was 71 years old, arthritic in both hands, and he had not slept well in 3 years. Morwenna had found him 6 weeks ago through the network of lower burial house workers who passed information through the same channels they passed everything else. Slowly, carefully, without writing anything down. Elias had carried the royal coffin. He had not known at the time that it still held someone breathing. He had understood what he had done only later, when the man who returned from the assassination attempt had eyes that moved a half-second differently than the eyes of the man Elias had last seen alive. He told Morwenna this in the back of a storage room in the lower burial house, with the smell of ash, soap around them, and the sound of the main hall workers moving in the distance. He said he had not spoken about it because the other corpse-bearers who had been on that night had disappeared one by one over the following year. Morwenna told him she would protect him. She told him to stay in the lower burial house, to tell no one his name, to let her build the chain of testimony before anyone knew he existed as a witness. She told him this because she believed it was the safest option. She told him this because she was afraid, not of dying, but of what Severin would do to the lower burial house records if Elias was found too early, before there were enough witnesses to make burning the testimony pointless. She was wrong about what constituted safety. Severin found Elias 4 days later. The charges appeared in the death registry before the trial. Elias Rook, corpse-bearer, grave theft of royal burial artifacts, attempted desecration of Veyne crown property. He was placed in a death cell. His name appeared in the registry's pending column. A bone record from the original assassination night, a small fragment of cortical ash that was the only physical confirmation that a royal body had been interred and not merely stored, was ground to dust before Morwenna could reach the archive. Alaric came to her. He said the testimony of a man accused of grave theft was not admissible as royal evidence, which she knew, and that the bone record was gone, which she knew, and that he now had a court full of nobles being told she had constructed an elaborate desecration, conspiracy, which she also knew. She went to the death cell herself. Elias said, through the bars, in the voice of a man who had been through enough to have no interest in softening things, "You tried to save my life by burying my testimony. But a witness hidden from the grave is only another name waiting to be miswritten." She stood on the other side of the door and understood what she had done. She had protected him the way the court protected its uncomfortable truths, by making him invisible, by deciding that his testimony was too fragile to be seen in the open, by treating a living witness like a burial secret. She had done to him exactly what had been done to her father. Alaric began going through the death commands. He did this alone, in the small hours before the court began, which was the only time he was alone enough to trust his own reading of the records. His kingdom had recorded every death ordered from the throne. It had never asked whether the throne itself was sitting on one, the plague ward closures, the lower grave clearances, the execution orders for wolves labeled grave rebels, a category that, when he read back through the original complaint files, appeared to mean people who asked questions about burial rites. He needed to hear it from people, not paper. Morwenna told him this. She did not ask permission to bring them. Marabelle arrived first. She was a small woman, dry-eyed in the way of people who have finished their weeping and arrived at something harder on the other side. She told Alaric that her son Aaron had developed a fever in the 3rd week of winter. She had brought him to the East Gate Plague Ward at dusk. The ward was locked. A placard on the door listed the closure order and the date it had been signed. Aaron had died before morning. She said his name again before she left, as if she thought the king might not have heard it properly the first time. Aaron Bell. She wanted to be sure it was in the room. The second witness was a woman named Dalla Gray, whose son Tovin had been executed 8 months ago as a grave rebel. Tovin's actual offense, as Dalla described it, had been protesting in the public square when a section of the lower burial ground was cleared to extend the royal training field perimeter. He had not been armed. He had not been violent. He had been loud. The execution record described him as a threat to crown stability. Dalla said his name once and did not stay. Sister Anwen was 3rd. She was 68 and had run the lower burial house registration for 20 years. And she had the particular bearing of someone who had spent decades watching the powerless be recorded, as categories rather than people. She placed a registry on the table in front of Alaric. It documented 300 unnamed bodies that had been burned for space over the past 2 years during the lower grave clearances. Each entry had been reduced to a number, age approximate, cause of death listed as clearance matter. No names. Sister Anwen said that every one of those bodies had had a face, a distinguishing mark, a story she could have traced if she had been given time before the burning order came through. She said she had kept what records she could in private, in violation of the Crown Registry order. She placed the private record on top of the official one. She said nothing else. She did not need to. Alaric sat with these witnesses for a long time after they left. He was not empty. He was not free. He was a half-soul who had signed whole deaths, and that was not an abstract calculation. That was Aaron Bell. That was Tovin Gray. That was Dalla Gray's face. That was 300 numbers that Sister Anwen had known as people. Lady Octavia Veyne had been waiting for the right moment to stop being useful to Severin. She had not found it for 3 years. She had been at court when Alaric returned from the assassination attempt. And she had noticed the difference, the way his eyes tracked slightly behind his words, the way his wolf scent had changed, in a way she could not name, but could feel in the particular discomfort that came when something familiar presented itself as wrong. She had stayed silent. She had her family's position to consider. Her family's position had benefited from the lower grave clearances, which had freed land for a border realignment that gave the Veyne noble houses more grazing territory. She had worn very fine silk to the ceremony, where that territory was formalized. She had not asked where the graves had gone. When Morwenna came to her, uninvited, in the afternoon garden, she said exactly what the grave girl was there to say. Morwenna said, "Your family received land during the clearances. Your silence about the change in the Alpha King has lasted 3 years. You noticed. You made a choice." Octavia looked at her rings. She said, "I wore white for a king who was already being buried." Then I smiled when they told me he had returned. She reached into the chest pocket of her outer gown and withdrew a piece of cloth. It was a mourning cloth, the specific kind prepared for royal funerals, bearing the wolf crest of the Veyne bloodline, stitched in black on white. It had been started the night of the assassination. It had never been finished, because a death that was supposed to be announced had been quietly reversed. And the cloth had been tucked away by a court attendant who could not quite bring herself to burn. Something that had been prepared in good faith for a real death. Octavia placed the cloth on the stone bench between them. She said, "A title that asks me to misname the dead is only a prettier shovel." She was not quoting Morwenna. She was arriving at the same place from a different direction. Morwenna picked up the cloth without thanking her. She walked back to the lower burial house. She added it to the chain. A body found by one grave girl could be called desecration. A body named by witnesses became a truth no throne could sit above. Morwenna had Elias's coffin testimony, recorded through the bars of the death cell by 3 separate scribes before Severin could prevent it. She had Bram Graves's missing death record, corrected in the private ledger by a registry keeper who had been afraid to enter the correction publicly. She had Octavia's mourning cloth, which bore the specific symbolic markers of a royal death preparation that had never been officially acknowledged. She had Sister Anwen's private records of 300 unnamed bodies. She had Mara Bell and Dalla Gray, who would speak their names in public if given the opportunity. She had Alaric's own fractured memory of the night in question, the sound of a coffin lid, the cold of Severin's hand on his brow, the way a name became something that could be spoken from the outside, but no longer felt like it originated from inside. She had a king who was beginning to believe that the knocking beneath his feet was not settling stone. She went to Alaric. She said, "Severin will move to seal the crypt permanently. If he does, the body decomposes beyond identification. The half-shadow becomes the only Alaric that can be proven. Every death command from the last 3 years becomes permanently unreviewable." She said, "We need a public naming right, not a coup, not a necromantic accusation. A witness death court where every name in the chain is spoken aloud before the throne." Alaric said, "If the full truth opens, the court will fracture." She said, "I hear a king asking to stop being used as a foundation." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What do I need to do?" Severin was faster than she expected. The seal order came through the Chancellor's office on the morning of the naming rite, citing necromantic interference with royal burial grounds. Funeral bells should not have rung. No one had touched them. They rang anyway. A long, measured tolling that moved through the palace walls like something that had been waiting for permission. The death court assembled not because Severin wanted it to, but because the bells had called it the way bells in Veyne Kingdom were supposed to call it, and stopping a bell mid-toll was a specific kind of bad omen that even the court's pragmatic factions were unwilling to test. Morwenna opened the grave name chain in public. Marabelle spoke Aaron's name and the plague ward edict that had locked the door. Dalla Gray spoke Tovin's name and the execution order that had called questioning a burial an act of rebellion. Sister Anwen opened the private registry, 300 numbers. She read them as descriptions, age, distinguishing marks, the ward they had come from, the cause of death, where she had been able to determine it, because she had refused to let them become numbers, even when the official record had. Octavia placed the mourning cloth on the death court table. Elias Rook's scripted testimony was read aloud by 3 scribes simultaneously, which was the legal requirement for testimony from a party in a death cell. He had described the coffin. He had described the night. He had described Bram Graves walking beside him and then not walking beside him in the morning. Alaric placed his hand on the throne stone. The crypt door opened partway, and then Severin moved. He had the bone record in a sealed case. He opened it. He crushed the remaining ash fragment before the court's eyes with the specific methodical calm of a man who had thought several moves ahead. The coffin name in the crypt, without the bone record's verification, began to blur. The grave marks on Morwenna's hands went cold. Her fingers went numb from the inside out, the specific cold that came when a name was being removed from the chain, when a proof was being dissolved before it could finish being spoken. She could not hear Alaric's grave name. For 3 seconds, perhaps 4, the name was simply gone from her perception. The half-shadow king on the dais began to flicker at the edges. It was barely visible, a slight translucence where solidity should have been. But the court saw it. The court saw the possibility of an empty throne. The sound in that room was unlike any other sound Morwenna had heard. It was the sound of power confronting the thing it feared more than death. Severin said, "A truth that empties a throne is treason wearing a funeral veil." He said it to the court, not to Morwenna. He said it to the part of the court that was not motivated by justice, but by the fear that justice, if too thoroughgoing, would leave them without anyone to blame except themselves. Morwenna said, "Then bury the throne. The dead were here first." She turned to Alaric. She did not command him. She did not order him. She simply said the names: Aaron Bell, Tovin Gray, Bram Graves, Elias Rook, the 300 unnamed lower dead. They did not die for a throne's convenience. They died because a throne that was not fully there needed to keep signing orders to pretend it was. For one breath, she could not tell whether the cold in her hands belonged to the bodies she carried, the throne crypt, or the king who had been ruling from the wrong side of his own grave. Alaric stood. He stepped down from the dais. He walked to the floor of the throne hall, and he placed both hands flat against the stone, and he said, in the voice of a man choosing something he would not be able to unchoose, "I choose the body that makes my crown answer for its deaths." The throne crypt opened. The coffin inside bore a name that had been trying for 3 years to be correctly attached to a death. Half-shadow Alaric did not vanish. That was the thing about shadows that had been carrying a piece of something real. They did not disappear when the truth arrived. They reconciled, painfully, and without ceremony, and with the particular rawness of a thing that had been split being, forced to acknowledge the other half. The wolf soul that returned to him was wounded. It was whole. Severin's registry burned itself black at the signature lines. The throne cracked from the base to the crown seat. Down the exact center, Severin tried to reach the door. He found that the door's death registry lock, the one that operated on the authority of the Chancellor's seal, had stopped recognizing his seal approximately 30 seconds ago. The court took him into custody with the particular efficiency of people who had been waiting for permission. He did not announce his accountability from the throne. The throne was cracked. He stood at the edge of the dais floor on level ground, and he said what he had to say without the elevation of the chair behind him. If I was only half alive, then I used half a soul to sign whole deaths. He named them. Aaron Bell, who had needed a door to open and found it locked under his seal. Tovin Gray, who had been executed for asking questions that the court had decided were too inconvenient to answer. Bram Graves, who had carried truth to a place where truth was unwelcome and had been buried under the wrong cause of death for his trouble. Elias Rook, who had been placed in a death cell for the crime of having seen something he was not supposed to see. The 300 unnamed lower dead, whose names Sister Anwen's private registry was going to return to. The official record before the week was out. He opened a formal review of death commands from the previous 3 years. He reopened the plague wards. He ordered the lower grave restoration to begin with what records still existed. He freed Elias. He stripped Severin of death authority and referred him for examination under the oldest burial law, still on the books, the one that predated Severin's legal revisions, and which had, for 600 years, specified that any official who caused a death record to be falsified was subject to the same burial law as the person whose record had been changed. He did not use Morwenna's name in any of this. He did not say she had done it. He said the dead had done it, the dead and the witnesses they had left behind. Morwenna did not correct him. The named burial covenant was signed in the lower burial archive, not in the throne room. The throne room had a cracked throne that no one had yet decided what to do with. The archive had records. It seemed like the right room. The covenant established 5 things. No royal body might be interred beneath a throne or seat of power without a public death witness from outside the court. No death record could be amended by crown authority alone. Unnamed lower graves were to be restored with names wherever the physical or documentary evidence existed. Corpse-bearer testimony could not be dismissed on grounds of class or occupation in any proceeding, touching on burial rites. Commands signed under a documented case of soul separation or shadow rite must be individually reviewed for accountability. The final clause was 1 sentence. No throne shall stand higher than the name of the dead beneath it. Morwenna signed as keeper of unburied kings, not because she had been appointed, not because Alaric had given her the title, because the kingdom needed something the role described, and she was the person who understood what it required. And sometimes a role came into existence because someone was already doing the work and it only remained to give the work a name. He found her in the lower burial garden, which was not a garden in any decorative sense but a strip of planted earth beside the burial house, where the workers grew the herbs they used in the washing rites. He came without his crown, without guards, without the particular posture that Alpha Kings learned to maintain in rooms where they needed to be, believed. He said, "What do I sound like now?" She listened, not to his voice, to the wolf beneath it. "Like someone cold," she said. He absorbed that. "And alive?" she said. "Like someone learning the difference." He sat down on the low stone wall at the edge of the herb beds. He did not reach for her. He did not invoke the mate bond that had been sitting between them, unspoken, since the first time he had looked at her in the throne hall, and his wolf had gone still in the specific way that wolves went. Still, when they encountered something they could not categorize as enemy or stranger, he said, "I will not make you proof that I am more than a grave." She looked at him. "Good," she said. "I am not a priestess for your resurrection." The herb bed smelled of the rosemary she had planted last autumn. It was a very ordinary smell for a garden that sat next to a burial house. She had chosen it deliberately. Dead things, she had learned long ago, still responded to ordinary smells. They sat in the garden for a while, in the kind of silence that was not empty, but was simply not yet, ready for more words. Above them, the palace bells were quiet for the first time in 3 days. A month later, the throne crypt had been converted into the named burial hall. The coffin that had held Alaric's body was moved to a marked grave in the royal cemetery. The grave was properly named. The cracked throne in the hall above had not been repaired. A thin line of stone and a gap where the crack ran down the center had simply been left. The court had debated removing it. Alaric had said no. He said it was a record. Lower Burial House was operating again under Sister Anwen, and 3 new workers hired through a process that, for the first time, did not require applicants to have noble backing. Marabelle had placed flowers for Aaron in the cleared lower burial ground on the day the restoration of names began. She had not said anything to anyone. She had placed the flowers and stood there for a long time and then walked home. Tovin Gray's execution record had been corrected. Bram Graves's death record had been corrected. Elias Rook was alive. Barely, because 3 weeks in a death cell had not been kind to his arthritis or his lungs, but alive, and he had given the official testimony he had been trying to give for 3 years, and it was now in the permanent record in 3 separate locations. Alaric stood in the lower court that morning to hear petitions. He stood below the dais, not above it. The cracked throne was visible through the open doors behind him. Morwenna sat at the witness bench. A child of about 7 came to the front of the petition line. She had been brought by an older woman who held her hand and did not let go. The child looked at Morwenna rather than at the king. She asked, "If no one remembers your name, are you really dead?" Morwenna considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. She said, "No, but someone has to love the truth enough to call you back from the number they gave you." The child nodded, with the grave satisfaction of someone who had received an answer they intended to. "Remember." The petition line continued. The morning light came through the low windows of the burial hall. The court had once mocked the girl who smelled of graves. But under Morwenna's watch, Vine Kingdom learned that death was not the enemy of power. Lies were. A throne could be rebuilt. A crown could be recast. But a body buried under the wrong name would keep knocking until the living finally opened the floor.